Hello, happy Friday. Welcome to Election Bites, our short conversation series on key U.S. election issues. I'm Soyia Ellison, an Associate Director of Communications here at the Carter Center. And joining me today is Nathan Stock. He's an adjunct professor of political dialogue at Furman University. And he also spent about a decade working with us here at the Carter Center on Middle East conflict. He's here with us again now, consulting on our project that's working to mitigate possible unrest around the US election. So thank you for joining us, Nathan.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start today. I know our topic is on what community leaders can do to help support peaceful elections. But let me ask you first to just very quickly talk about what the Carter Center is doing on this issue.
Sure. So the Carter Center began by trying to better understand the problem. So we spent time looking at protests over the last summer, potential sources of violence and unrest at the community level. We dug into some of the roots of the polarization that has been really profound in American society, particularly over the last few years. And from there, we did something of a stakeholder mapping exercise. We tried to understand, all right, who are the influential figures at the community level who can be bridge builders, who can push back against some of this. And one of the key sectors we identified were faith leaders, religious leaders. So that's been a lot of the focus of our effort. And in particular, we've done two things. We've put together a set of basic messages designed to instill confidence in the electoral process and just help people remain calm through this fraught time. We've been pushing those messages out to faith leaders around the country. We've also done a series of trainings with some of our partner organizations, trainings on what to do should you encounter an incident of violence, very basic tactical things on how to de-escalate, how to remain safe if one is protesting, things like that.
Okay. So tell me, what are a few of the key messages that you've been asking community and faith leaders to share with their folks?
This is civic participation 101. First, vote. Second, be patient. We know there is an extraordinary amount of mail-in balloting in this election season, largely because of COVID. So in many states, it's going to take longer than Americans are used to get a final result. So don't be alarmed if we can't call the election on election night. That's not the way this is going to go. Um, More generally, recall that while there are flaws in the US election system, as is true in any election system, we do have some track record of doing this pretty well. The average election worker in the US has worked 7 prior elections. So there are reasons to have some confidence in the integrity of the process. Um, for especially for people who are in influential positions among their friends and their communities, be careful with how you share information, especially on social media. We know that you always need to be vigilant about disinformation, especially now. So try to assess sources before you forward things on to your friends. And finally, remember that every generation has a civic and patriotic obligation to do our part to uphold our democracy. This is part of that. Participating in this process, voting, uh, experiencing this civic process with our fellow Americans is our job in this generation.
So, those are some good messages that we can share. Are there other things that community leaders or faith leaders can be doing at this time that might be helpful?
I think as much as possible in the era of COVID, it's important to be bringing people together for constructive purposes. So if it's possible in a socially distanced manner to organize events, whether that's get out the vote drives or after the election, getting people together to clean up litter on a highway, like reminding Americans in a real way of the ties that bind us, despite all of the polarization and vitriol in our media. I think there's a lot of value in that. Giving people things to do as opposed to sitting around being worried about the state of our politics or our democracy.
Right. So, let me step back and ask you this. How did we even get to a place in this country where we're talking about the possibility of election related violence? I'm sure there's a long answer, but maybe a couple things.
Sure. Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that the vast majority of Americans don't want violence. This past summer saw what may be the largest protest movement in US history. And if you dig into the data on those protests, 95% of them were peaceful. So that's a positive sign. Having said that, there's no question that the American body politic is polarized in ways we have not seen in decades and decades. And in particular, our political identities are becoming a kind of almost tribal identity. Our political divisions are increasingly overlapping and reinforcing with ethnic and racial and class and other differences in American society. So we're ending up in a place where we're in these two giant camps, and it makes it hard to understand the other side. It makes it easy to dehumanize one's opponents. It makes it hard to govern. So there's no question there is a real challenge here that's going to require realistically decades of work to unwind.
And I think that's a great segue to the last question that I have for you, which is that after this election, what work do Americans need to be doing to help reduce this extreme polarization that's happening? And I know we can probably look at the big picture, but also specifically since this talk is for community leaders, what community leaders might be doing.
Sure. Uh, I think it's important to keep in mind that the election itself is not going to solve these problems, regardless of who you support or who gets elected. The election is just not going to address the underlying drivers of these deep divisions in American society. What do we do about that? Well, in the medium term, we need interventions from two levels. You need governmental intervention from the top down. You need, for example, a reinvestment in civic education. You need to prepare Americans, especially young Americans, for citizenship in what is increasingly a multi ethnic democracy, something we arguably haven't really had in the past, right? Given demographic change in the US. So there's a huge amount of investment and government resources that should be put into this. But there's also a huge amount of work that should happen from the bottom up at the community level, right? It is important to be deliberate about rebuilding civic ties in general, right? There's tons of data that suggests that every year Americans trust their fellow Americans less and less. So anything you can do to push Americans to come out to chicken barbecues, church socials, bowling leagues, knitting clubs, you name a lot of value in that. It rebuilds some of those communal fibers that have frayed. In particular, wherever possible, it is good to be deliberate about creating events, institutions, activities that pull people together across some of these specific fault lines in American society, across lines of race, across lines of class, across lines of political ideology. A lot of the social capital and the institutions we have in American life are also divided across this big chasm, and in a sense that doesn't help. So we have to find ways to be very deliberate in pushing against the forces that polarize us. And I think, especially if we look locally at community level interventions, I think there's a lot you can do, but we need a focus on it. We need resources, we need philanthropic dollars, etc.
Great. Well, I think this has been a great conversation. You've given us a lot of good things to think about in a very short period of time. So I want to say thank you to you and thank you to our audience for joining us all week on these election bites. And our final word, besides have a good weekend, is don't forget to vote. And we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thanks.